Okay guys, today we are going to be reading and annotating a short story called Ghost of the Lagoon. You need to make sure that you have this paper copy of Ghost of the Lagoon from the substitute, and this is going to go in the study section of your binder. So make sure that you have this packet and that it goes in the study section of your binder. Just like always, if you want to tear apart the staples, you can. Just make sure that you put the story in your binder in order. So we are just going to read and annotate this story today. You will see that there are also questions, but you don't need to start those questions until tomorrow. So today your only goal is that you will need to read and annotate this story. Tomorrow you'll answer the questions and you'll fill out the plot map. And then on Wednesday you are going to have your first summative test. That summative test is going to ask you a lot of questions about this story. So you need to make sure that you really understand what is happening in this story. As I'm reading and annotating, if it starts going too fast for you, you can pause this video and get caught up and then press play again. So this is called Ghost of the Lagoon. You need to make sure you have a highlighter and something to write with so that you can annotate right along with me. So it says, the island of Bora Bora, where Mako lived, is far away in the South Pacific. It is not a large island. You can paddle around it in a single day, but the main body of it rises straight out of the sea, very high into the air like a castle. Waterfalls trail down the faces of the cliffs. As you look upward, you see wild goats leaping from crag to crag. Okay, let's stop there because we have a lot of good information about our setting. So we see that this setting is on the island of Bora Bora, which is in the South Pacific. We see that it's a small island. It says it's not very large. And we see that there is waterfalls. There's waterfalls, and there's cliffs, and there's wild goats. So we get a really good idea of where this story is taking place. So this is our setting. Remember, setting is part of the exposition. Another thing that's part of the exposition is characters. And we see that Mako is one of our characters. So Mako lives on the island of Bora Bora. So now we're in paragraph 2. It says, Mako had been born on the very edge of the sea, and most of his waking hours were spent in the waters of the lagoon, which was nearly enclosed by 2 outstretched arms of the island. He was very clever with his hands. He had made a harpoon that was as straight as an arrow and tipped with 5 pointed iron spears. He had made a canoe, hollowing it out of a tree. It wasn't a very big canoe, only a little longer than his own height. It had an outrigger, a sort of balancing pole, fastened to one side to keep the boat from tipping over. The canoe was just large enough to hold Mako and his little dog, Afa. They were great companions, these two. Okay, so we learned a little bit of information. We learned that Mako was born on the very edge of the sea, and he spent most of his time in the lagoon, which is, it tells us that this was an area of water that's almost completely enclosed by the island. So here we're learning about Mako's early life. It says that he was very clever with his hands. So that means that he was really good at making things with his hands. It says that he made a harpoon, which is a sort of weapon. It's kind of like a spear a little bit. So he made a harpoon, and he also made a canoe by hollowing out a tree. So a canoe is a small type of boat. It's similar to a kayak. And it says that it wasn't very long. It was just a little longer than how tall he was. And it had an outrigger. So you'll see the word outrigger is underlined. So when a word is underlined, you know that you are probably going to be asked about what that word means when you have to answer questions. So it says it had an outrigger. And then right next to the word outrigger, it tells us what an outrigger is. It says it's a sort of balancing pole that is put on the side of the boat to help keep the boat from tipping over. And then it says that that canoe was just large enough to hold Mako and his little dog Afa. So Afa is another character in this story. So far we have Mako and we have his dog, Afa. One evening, Mako lay stretched at full length on the pandanus mats, listening to Grandfather's voice. Overhead, stars shone in the sky. From far off came the thunder of the surf on the reef. Okay, so we have another character. We have Grandfather. The old man was speaking of Tupa, the ghost of the lagoon. Ever since the boy could remember, he had heard tales of this terrible monster. Frightened fishermen, returning from the reef at midnight, spoke of the ghost. Over the evening fires, old men told endless tales about the monster. Okay, so we learn about another character called Tupa. And Tupa is what they refer to as the ghost of the lagoon. So people think that he's this ghost that lives in the lagoon, in that body of water by the island. And it says that frightened fishermen and old men came back terrified of this ghost of the lagoon, terrified of Tupa. It says Tupa seemed to think the lagoon of Bora Bora belonged to him. The natives left presents of food for him out on the reef. A dead goat, a chicken, or a pig. The presents always disappeared mysteriously, but everyone felt sure that it was Tupa who carried them away. Still, in spite of all this food, the nets of the fishermen were torn during the night, the fish stolen. What an appetite Tupa seemed to have. So we learned some information here about Tupa. So Tupa lives in the lagoon. We also learn that the people give Tupa food. So they are giving Tupa food, trying to keep him away. But it says that still, in spite of all this food, even though they got so much food, the nets of the fishermen were still torn. It says Tupa still tore through the nets and stole all the fish. Not many people had ever seen the ghost of the lagoon. Grandfather was one of the few who had. "What does he really look like, Grandfather?" the boy asked for the 100th time. The old man shook his head solemnly. The light from the cook fire glistened on his white hair. "Tupa lives in the great caves of the reef. He is longer than this house. There is a sail on his back, not large but terrible to see, for it burns with a white fire. Once when I was fishing beyond the reef at night, I saw him come up right under another canoe." "What happened then?" Mako asked. He half rose on one elbow. This was a story he had not heard before. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. Tupa dragged the canoe right under the water, and the water boiled with white flame. The 3 fishermen in it were never seen again. Fine swimmers they were, too. Grandfather shook his head. "It is bad fortune even to speak of Tupa. There is evil in his very name." Okay, so we learn here that Tupa is huge. Tupa is longer than the house, and there's a sail on his back. So we get a physical description of Tupa. And it says that Tupa, so he came up to a canoe and he dragged the canoe right under the water. So Tupa attacked 3 fishermen and dragged their canoe under the water. So it says, "But King Opanui has offered a reward for his capture," the boy pointed out. 30 acres of fine coconut land and a sailing canoe as well," said the old man. "But who ever heard of laying hands on a ghost?" Mako's eyes glistened. 30 acres of land and a sailing canoe. How I should love to win that reward. So we see that Mako wants to win this reward. He wants to capture Tupa and win the reward. Mako wants to capture Tupa and win the reward. Grandfather nodded, but Mako's mother scolded her son for such foolish talk. Be quiet now, son, and go to sleep. Grandfather has told you that it is bad fortune to speak of Tupa. Alas, how well we have learned that lesson. Your father, she stopped herself. What of my father? The boy asked quickly, and now he sat up straight on the mats. Tell him, grandfather, his mother whispered. The old man cleared his throat and poked at the fire. A little shower of sparks whirled up into the darkness. So we have one more character here. We have Mako's mother as another character that is part of our exposition. And we learn that there's a secret now surrounding Mako's father. So we're on the second page now. It says, your father, he explained gently, was one of the 3 fishermen in the canoe that Tupa destroyed. His words fell upon the air like stones dropped into a deep well. Okay, so we see that Tupa killed Mako's father. Okay, Tupa killed Mako's father. Mako shivered. He brushed back the hair from his damp forehead. Then he squared his shoulders and cried fiercely, I shall slay Tupa and win the king's reward. He rose to his knees, his slim body tense, his eyes flashing in the firelight. So because Tupa killed Mako's father, Mako is now determined to capture Tupa. Mako is determined to get revenge on Tupa. Hush, his mother said. Go to sleep now. Enough of such foolish talk. Would you bring trouble upon us all? Mako lay down again upon the mats. He rolled over on his side and closed his eyes, but sleep was long in coming. The palm trees whispered above the dark lagoon, and far out on the reef, the sea thundered. The boy was slow to wake the next morning. The ghost of Tupa had played through his dreams, making him restless. And so it was almost noon before Mako sat up on the mats and stretched himself. He called Afa, and the boy and his dog ran down to the lagoon for their morning swim. When they returned to the house, wide awake and hungry, Mako's mother had food ready and waiting. These are the last of our bananas, she told him. I wish you would paddle out to the reef this afternoon and bring back a new bunch. The boy agreed eagerly. Nothing pleased him more than such an errand, which would take him to a little island on the outer reef, 1/2 mile from shore. It was one of Mako's favorite playgrounds, and there bananas and oranges grew in plenty. Okay, so we see that Mako's mom wants him to go and gather some bananas. So Mako's mother needs Mako to get more bananas. And he is going to have to go to the reef to find these bananas. They don't just go to the grocery store like you and I do. They have to go and get the bananas off of this other island. Come, Afa, he called, gulping the last mouthful. We're going on an expedition. He picked up his long-bladed knife and seized his spear. A minute later, he dashed across the white sand where his canoe was drawn up beyond the water's reach. Afa barked at his heels. He was all white except for a black spot over each eye. Wherever Mako went, there went Afa also. Now the little dog leaped into the bow of the canoe, his tail wagging with delight. The boy shoved the canoe into the water and climbed aboard. Then, picking up his paddle, he thrust it into the water. The canoe shot ahead. Its sharp bow cut through the green water of the lagoon like a knife through cheese. And so clear was the water that Mako could see the coral gardens 40 feet below him growing in the sand. The shadow of the canoe moved over them. Okay, so we see that Mako and Afa, they are going to this reef, but they have to ride in the canoe to get over to this reef. So this paragraph right here is giving us more description of the setting. It's giving us more description of the setting. A school of fish swept by like silver arrows. He saw scarlet rock cod with ruby eyes and the head of a conger eel peering out from a cavern in the coral. The boy thought suddenly of Tupa, ghost of the lagoon. On such a bright day, it was hard to believe in ghosts of any sort. The fierce sunlight drove away all thought of them. Perhaps ghosts were only old men's stories anyway. Mako's eyes came to rest upon his spear, the spear that he had made with his own hands, the spear that was as straight and true as an arrow. He remembered his vow of the night before. Could a ghost be killed with a spear? Some night when all the village was sleeping, Mako swore to himself that he would find out. He would paddle out to the reef and challenge Tupa. Perhaps tonight. Why not? He caught his breath at the thought. A shiver ran down his back. His hands were tense on the paddle. So even though it's daylight and even though Mako is starting to doubt the existence of Tupa, he's still scared. He still is a little hesitant about potentially fighting Tupa. So I'm going to say that Mako fears Tupa. As the canoe drew away from shore, the boy saw the coral reef that, above all others, had always interested him. It was of white coral, a long, slim shape that rose slightly above the surface of the water. It looked very much like a shark. There was a ridge on the back that the boy could pretend was a dorsal fin, while up near one end were two dark holes that looked like eyes. Times without number, the boy had practiced spearing this make-believe shark, aiming always for the eyes, the most vulnerable spot. So true and straight had his aim become that the spear would pass right into the eye holes without even touching the sides of the coral. Mako had named the coral reef Tupa. So he sees this coral reef, and he thinks that this coral reef that he saw looks like a shark. And so he pretends that this coral reef is Tupa. Now, this coral reef is not the same Tupa that everyone is referring to. Everyone is referring to an actual terrible creature named Tupa. But in addition to that, Mako pretends that this coral reef that looks like a shark is Tupa. So Mako pretends the reef is Tupa. And so he pretends to practice aiming at this reef. He practices aiming at this reef so that he is able to eventually kill Tupa whenever he gets the opportunity to. So we're going to continue on. And it says, this morning, as he paddled past it, he shook his fist and called, "Ho, Mr. Tupa, just wait till I get my bananas. When I come back, I'll make short work of you." Alpha followed his master's words with a sharp bark. He knew Mako was excited about something. The bow of the canoe touched the sand of the little island where the bananas grew. Alpha leaped ashore and ran barking into the jungle, now on his trail, now on that. Clouds of seabirds whirled from their nests into the air with angry cries. Okay, so Mako and Alpha have arrived at the island where the bananas are. So Mako and Alpha make it to the banana island. Whoops. There we go. Mako climbed into the shallow water, waded ashore, and pulled his canoe up on the beach. Then, picking up his banana knife, he followed Alpha. In the jungle, the light was so dense and green that the boy felt as if he were moving underwater. Ferns grew higher than his head. The branches of the trees formed a green roof over him. A flock of parakeets fled on swift wings. Somewhere, a wild pig crashed through the undergrowth, while Alpha dashed away in pursuit. Mako paused anxiously. Armed only with his banana knife, he had no desire to meet the wild pig. The pig, it seemed, had no desire to meet him either. Okay, so Mako and Alpha, they are now on this island to get bananas. And we are seeing that it's very dense. There's jungle, there's a lot of trees, and there are ferns and plants that are growing even taller than he is. There's birds, and there's also a wild pig that the dog chases after. So there is a lot happening here on this banana island. Then ahead of him, the boy saw the broad green blades of a banana tree. A bunch of bananas, golden ripe, was growing out of the top. At the foot of the tree, he made a nest of soft leaves for the bunch to fall upon. In this way, the fruit wouldn't be crushed. Then with a swift slash of his blade, he cut the stem. The bananas fell to the earth with a dull thud. He found 2 more bunches. All right, so Mako gathers bananas, just like his mom wanted him to. Then he thought, I might as well get some oranges while I'm here. Those little rusty ones are sweeter than any that grow on Bora Bora. So he set about making a net out of palm leaves to carry the oranges. As he worked, his swift fingers moving in and out among the strong green leaves, he could hear Afa's excited barks off in the jungle. That was just like Afa, always barking at something. A bird, a fish, a wild pig. He never caught anything either. Still, no boy ever had a finer companion. The palm net took longer to make than Mako had realized. By the time it was finished and filled with oranges, the jungle was dark and gloomy. Night comes quickly and without warning in the islands of the tropics. Mako carried the fruit down to the shore and loaded it into the canoe. Then he whistled to Afa. The dog came bounding out of the bush, wagging his tail. Okay, so we see that it is now dark outside. Okay, so it is now dark outside. So he was over there getting bananas. He got distracted, decided to pick some oranges. And with all of that, all of a sudden, the sun is setting. And so he whistles to Afa so that they can get back home in time before it gets way, way, way too dark. Hurry, Mako scolded. We won't be home before the dark comes. The little dog leaped into the bow of the canoe, and Mako came aboard. Night seemed to rise up from the surface of the water and swallow them. On the distant shore of Bora Bora, cook fires were being lighted. The first star twinkled just over the dark mountains. Mako dug his paddle into the water, and the canoe leaped ahead. So they get in their canoe, and Mako and Afa start going back home. The dark water was alive with phosphorus. The bow of the canoe seemed to cut through a pale liquid fire. Each dip of the paddle trailed streamers of light. As the canoe approached the coral reef, the boy called, Ho, Tupa, it's too late tonight to teach you your lesson, but I'll come back tomorrow. The coral shark glistened in the darkness. Okay, so remember at this point he's talking to the fake Tupa, the coral reef, that he pretends is Tupa because it looks like a shark. And then suddenly, Mako's breath caught in his throat. His hands felt weak. Just beyond the fin of the coral Tupa, there was another fin, a huge one. It had never been there before. And, could he believe his eyes? It was moving. The boy stopped paddling. He dashed his hand across his eyes. Afa began to bark furiously. The great white fin, shaped like a small sail, glowed with phosphorescent light. Then Mako knew here was Tupa, the real Tupa, ghost of the lagoon. So this is a big moment here that Mako sees the real Tupa. His knees felt weak. He tried to cry out, but his voice died in his throat. The great shark was circling slowly around the canoe. With each circle, it moved closer and closer. Now the boy could see the phosphorescent glow of the great shark's sides. As it moved in closer, he saw the yellow eyes, the gill slits in its throat. So we learned that Tupa is not actually a ghost. Tupa is a shark. Tupa is a real-life shark. Not a ghost, but a shark that is living in the water. Alpha leaped from one side of the canoe to the other. In sudden anger, Mako leaned forward to grab the dog and shake him soundly. Alpha wriggled out of his grasp as Mako tried to catch him, and the shift in weight tipped the canoe on one side. The outrigger rose from the water. In another second, they would be overboard. The boy threw his weight over quickly to balance the canoe, but with a loud splash, Alpha fell over into the dark water. So this is a really important event that Alpha, the dog, falls into the water with a shark. Mako stared after him in dismay. The little dog, instead of swimming back to the canoe, had headed for the distant shore, and there was the great white shark, very near. Alpha, Alpha, come back, come quickly, Mako shouted. The little dog turned back toward the canoe. He was swimming with all his strength. Mako leaned forward. Could Alpha make it? Swiftly, the boy seized his spear. Bracing himself, he stood upright. There was no weakness in him now. His dog, his companion, was in danger of instant death. Okay, so Alpha is trying desperately to get back to the boat. And we see that Mako picks up his spear and he gets ready to fight because he wants to protect his dog. Okay, Mako wants to protect Alpha. Alpha was swimming desperately to reach the canoe. The white shark had paused in his circling to gather speed for the attack. Mako raised his arm, took aim. In that instant, the shark charged. Mako's arm flashed forward. All his strength was behind that thrust. The spear drove straight and true, right into the great shark's eye. Mad with pain and rage, Tupa whipped about, lashing the water in fury. The canoe rocked back and forth. Mako struggled to keep his balance as he drew back the spear by the cord and fastened to his wrist. Okay, so we see that Mako hit Tupa in the eye with his spear. He bent over to seize Alpha and drag him aboard. Then he stood up, not a moment too soon. Once again, the shark charged. Once again, Mako threw his spear, this time at the other eye. The spear found its mark. Blinded and weak from loss of blood, Tupa rolled to the surface, turned slightly on his side. Was he dead? Mako knew how clever sharks could be, and he was taking no chances. Scarcely daring to breathe, he paddled toward the still body. He saw the faintest motion of the great tail. The shark was still alive. The boy knew that one flip of that tail could overturn the canoe and send him and Alpha into the water where Tupa could destroy them. Swiftly yet calmly, Mako stood upright and braced himself firmly. Then, murmuring a silent prayer to the shark god, he threw his spear for the last time. Downward, swift as sound, the spear plunged into a white shoulder. Mako flung back his head and shouted for joy. Hitching a strong line about the shark's tail, the boy began to paddle toward the shore of Bora Bora. The dorsal fin, burning with the white fire of phosphorus, trailed after the canoe. So we see that Mako does successfully kill Tupa the shark. And then it says that he wraps a string around the shark's tail and he drags the shark back to Bora Bora. So Mako brings the shark back to his home island of Bora Bora. Men were running down the beaches of Bora Bora, shouting as they leaped into their canoes and put out across the lagoon. Their cries reached the boy's ears across the water. "It is Tupa, ghost of the lagoon," he heard them shout. "Mako has killed him." Okay, so we see that the people are happy that Mako killed Tupa. That night, as the tired boy lay on the pandanus mats, listening to the distant thunder of the sea, he heard grandfather singing a new song. It was a song which would be sung the next day at the feast which King Opanui would give in Mako's honor. The boy saw his mother bending over the cook fire. The stars leaned close, winking like friendly eyes. Grandfather's voice reached him now from a great distance. 30 acres of land and a sailing canoe. So we see that Mako wins the king's reward that we talked about at the very beginning of the story. Okay, so you need to make sure that you have all the same annotations I have. I know that was a lot of information, so you need to make sure that if you miss something that you go back and add it in. If there is still time left in class right now, then you can go ahead and get started on these questions. You need to make sure that you read the questions very clearly. We'll go over them in more detail tomorrow, but you can go ahead and get started on them. But you're going to have all of class tomorrow to finish answering these questions and to complete the plot map for the story before you take your test on Wednesday. So hang on to this story. Make sure it stays in your binder. Make sure it comes back with you to school tomorrow. If you have questions before tomorrow, you can email me. My email is posted on Schoology. It's also, I can say right now, so it's sbennett at coppellisd.com. So if you're really confused right now, then you can go ahead and email me and we'll go over the questions tomorrow together.